I sold my house on a Tuesday. I remember because it was raining. And the realtor handed me a check while water dripped off the awning onto my shoes. And I thought, this is fine. This is what mothers do. I didn't tell my son until 3 weeks later. By then, I'd already signed the lease on a studio apartment on the east side of Portland. Already packed 31 years of my life into a storage unit, already started calling the small space cozy, so I wouldn't call it what it actually was. Small, lonely, proof that I had given everything I had left to give. My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old, and this is the story of the night my son stood in front of 200 people and looked straight at me, the woman who sold her home so he could have his future, and said, I really wish she hadn't come. He didn't know I could hear him. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a bitter woman. I did not raise my son to be cruel. Somewhere between the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during car rides and the man in the black doctoral robe standing at that podium, something shifted, and for a long time, I told myself that shift was my fault, that if I had just done more, been more, given more, he would have turned out differently. It took me almost a year to understand that the problem was never that I gave too little. It was that I forgot to keep anything for myself. My husband, Robert, died when our son Daniel was 11 years old. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that gives you 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. We had just paid off the mortgage on our house in Beaverton. We had a savings account with enough in it to feel secure, but not enough to feel rich. We had a dog named Chester and a vegetable garden in the backyard and plans to drive Route 66 the summer Daniel turned 16. We did none of those things. After Robert died, I went back to work full-time at the school district, managing administrative records. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't well-paying work, but it had benefits, and it had stability. And when you are a widow with an 11-year-old son and a mortgage and a dog who eats like a small horse, stability is everything. Daniel was a quiet child after his father died. He turned inward in a way I recognized because I was doing the same thing. We became a small, careful unit, the two of us orbiting around the empty space where Robert used to be. I made his lunches every morning. I went to every single one of his soccer games, even the ones in the rain, even the away games 2 hours from home. I helped him with his homework until he knew more than I did, and then I sat next to him while he did it alone, just so he wouldn't feel the silence. When Daniel was 15, his 8th grade science teacher called me and said, Mrs. Harmon, your son is one of the most gifted students I have taught in 20 years. I cried in the car afterward. I cried because I was proud, and I cried because I knew what it meant. It meant I would spend the rest of his childhood making sure nothing got in the way of that gift. I did not go on a single date for 12 years. I want to say that clearly, not for sympathy, but because it matters to the rest of the story. I made a decision, consciously, that my job was Daniel. My social life, my romantic life, my personal ambitions, all of it went into a drawer, and the drawer stayed shut, and I told myself I was happy. Most days I believed it. Daniel got into Johns Hopkins on a partial scholarship. The financial aid package was good, but not enough. There was a gap of about $40,000 a year, which, over 4 years, meant $160,000 that needed to come from somewhere. I looked at the number for a long time. Then I got a second job. I worked weekends at a garden center in Hillsborough for 3 years. I cashed out a portion of my retirement savings, enough to make my financial advisor wince. I applied for every parent loan the government would give me. And slowly, year by year, I covered it. Every tuition bill, every semester's housing, the laptop he needed sophomore year, the conference fees when he started presenting his research, the plane ticket when he got into the doctoral program at the University of Michigan. I stood in my kitchen the day he called to tell me, and I wept the kind of tears that start in your chest. My son, my quiet, brilliant, careful son, a PhD program, full funding for the first 2 years, and I would help cover the rest. You don't have to do that, Mom, he said when I told him I would help. I know, I said. I want to. That was the truest thing I ever said to him. And also, in retrospect, the beginning of a pattern I should have broken much sooner. I noticed the change gradually, The way you notice seasons changing not in a single day, but in the accumulation of small details, until one morning you look up and realize summer is gone. Daniel had always been attentive. He called every Sunday. He remembered my birthday. He thanked me genuinely for everything I did. But somewhere in his third year of the doctoral program, something began to shift. He started dating a woman named Courtney. She was finishing her law degree, sharp and confident, from a family in Connecticut that owned what Daniel described as a couple of properties. I liked her at first. She was interesting to talk to. She had opinions about things. The first time I felt something I couldn't quite name was Thanksgiving of Daniel's 4th year. I had driven 18 hours to Ann Arbor to spend the holiday with them. Courtney's parents flew in from Hartford. They stayed at a hotel downtown, the nice one, with valet parking. I stayed on Daniel and Courtney's couch. At dinner, Courtney's father told a long story about a sailing trip in the Azores. When he finished, Daniel laughed and said, "We have to do that someday." He looked at Courtney when he said it. He did not look at me. I told myself I was being sensitive. He was 28 years old. Of course, he was building a life that didn't center on his mother. That was healthy. That was correct. I drove home on the Sunday after Thanksgiving, 18 hours back to Portland, and I told myself everything was fine. The following spring, Daniel defended his dissertation. 5 years of work, a committee of 4 professors, a document that ran 412 pages, which he emailed to me and which I printed out and read in its entirety, understanding perhaps 30% of it and feeling prouder than I had words for. He passed with distinction. The department threw a celebration dinner small, just colleagues and committee members and family. I bought a new dress, navy blue with a small floral pattern at the collar. I drove to the airport, flew to Detroit, rented a car, drove to Ann Arbor, checked into a Holiday Inn, and I was ready 40 minutes early. At the dinner, Courtney's parents were seated at the main table with Daniel and his advisor. I was at a table near the back with 2 graduate students I didn't know, and a professor who spent most of the evening on his phone. I thought it was a seating mistake. I almost said something. Instead, I smiled and introduced myself to the graduate students and asked about their research, because that is what I do. I make things comfortable for other people. When Daniel gave a short speech thanking everyone who had supported his work, he thanked his advisor by name. He thanked his committee. He thanked Courtney. He thanked Courtney's father for the mentorship and the belief. He thanked, in a general way, everyone who helped along the way. I had sold my house. I had worked weekends for 3 years at a garden center in Hillsborough. I was everyone who helped along the way. I sat with that for the rest of dinner. I sat with it quietly and I smiled when anyone looked at me, and I ate whatever was put in front of me. And when the evening was over, I drove back to the Holiday Inn and I sat on the edge of the bed in my navy dress with the floral collar, and I thought, this is not fine. This has not been fine for a while. But I still did not say anything. The graduation ceremony was held on a Saturday in May. It was a beautiful day, the kind of Michigan spring that feels like an apology for the winter. The ceremony was at Hill Auditorium, and the seats filled quickly. Daniel had given me 1 guest ticket. Courtney's parents had 4. I found out about this the morning of the ceremony when I arrived at the building, and Courtney's mother, Patricia, mentioned casually that their whole group was sitting together in Section C. I smiled and said how wonderful. And then I found my single seat in Section F, near the back left, next to a very kind, elderly gentleman who was there for his granddaughter and who offered me a butterscotch candy from his pocket, which I accepted because I needed something to hold on to. The doctoral candidates processed in. I found Daniel immediately. I have always been able to find him in a crowd. Something that has not changed since he was a small boy on a soccer field. He was tall and composed in his black robe, and he looked so much like his father in that moment that my breath caught. He did not look for me. The ceremony was long and beautiful, and I was genuinely moved for most of it. Somewhere near the end, during a reception held in the atrium afterward, I made my way through the crowd to find Daniel. I had a card in my purse with a letter I had written him, 3 pages, handwritten, everything I had wanted to say for years. I found him near the windows, surrounded by his department colleagues and Courtney's family and several people I didn't recognize. I waited at the edge of the group. When he saw me, he came over, hugged me, said, "You made it, Mom, great." Then someone called his name, and he turned away. I stood there for a moment, and then I stepped back, because I did not want to be in the way. That was when I heard it. I was perhaps 6 feet away, half hidden by a pillar, and Daniel was talking to Courtney's father with his back to me. Someone in the group said something about family, and Daniel's voice dropped slightly, and he said clearly enough, I really wish she hadn't come. It just makes things more complicated. The noise of the atrium continued. People laughed somewhere to my left. A photographer moved through the crowd. I stood behind that pillar, and I felt something I can only describe as a sound. Not one I heard, but one I felt in my sternum. A low and complete crack, like a floorboard finally giving way under weight it had been holding for too long. I straightened my back. I put the card with the 3-page letter back in my purse. I walked out of Hill Auditorium into the May afternoon, and I kept walking until I reached my rental car, and I sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes, and then I drove back to the Holiday Inn. I did not say goodbye. I need to tell you what happened in the parking lot, because this is the part of the story where I made the choice that changed everything. I sat in that rental car, and I had 2 options. I could go back inside. I could pull Daniel aside and tell him what I had heard, and it would become a scene tearful and complicated and ultimately unresolved, the way those things always are. Or I could leave, but more than that, I could stop. Not stop loving him. I want to be clear about that. There are things a mother's love simply will not do, and one of them is disappear because her son said something unforgivable at his graduation party. But I could stop arranging my entire existence around a person who had begun to see that existence as an inconvenience. I drove back to the hotel. I called my sister, Diane, in Sacramento. I told her what had happened. She said, "Margaret, how much have you given that boy?" And when I started to answer, she stopped me. "No," she said. "All of it." "How much?" And I went quiet, because the honest answer was, all of it. Almost all of it. "Then you need to stop," Diane said. I stayed in Ann Arbor one more day. I did not contact Daniel. I did not answer his text the next morning that said, "Hey, Mom, you disappeared, everything okay?" I drove to the airport. I flew home to Portland, to my studio apartment on the east side, to the small, quiet, honest space that was mine. And then I called my financial advisor and I told her to stop the automatic transfer I had set up to help Daniel with his third-year expenses. She paused. Then she said, "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." Daniel called 4 days later. "Mom, the transfer didn't come through." "I know," I said. "Is something wrong with the account?" "No," I said. "I decided to stop." A long pause. "What do you mean, you decided to stop?" "I mean, I'm not going to continue covering those expenses. You have your stipend. Courtney is working. You'll be fine." "Mom." His voice shifted into something I recognized, the tone of a person who has become very accustomed to things working out. "I've built my budget around that transfer." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry for the short notice. I should have given you more time. But the transfer is done." Another silence. Did something happen? Did I do something? I had thought very carefully about how to answer this question. I did not want to have the parking lot conversation over the phone. I did not want to weaponize what I had overheard into a dramatic confrontation. That was not what I was doing. What I was doing was simpler and more honest. "Nothing happened," I said. "I've been giving beyond my means for a long time, and I've decided to stop. This is about me, not about you." He did not believe me, but he also could not argue with it, because it was true. The months that followed were not comfortable. Daniel called less. When he did call, there was a stiffness in his voice that hadn't been there before, a wariness, as though he wasn't sure what I might take away next. Courtney sent me a very polite email asking if everything was all right with us, which I answered with an equally polite email saying that everything was fine and I hoped the job search was going well. I spent those months doing something I had not done in decades. I spent them on myself. I joined a watercolor class on Wednesday evenings at the community center near my apartment. I started going to a book club that met at a wine bar on the first Thursday of every month. I signed up for a beginner's hiking group and learned that my body, at 62, was still capable of climbing a trail if I went at my own pace. I had dinner with Diane when she came up to visit in September, and we sat on my small balcony and talked until 2 in the morning the way we hadn't since we were young women. I started to remember who I was before I became only someone's mother. I am not saying motherhood wasn't central to my identity. It was. It is. But there is a difference between being a mother and being only a mother. And somewhere in the years of tuition payments and Sunday calls and solo drives across the country, I had collapsed those two things into one and lost the distinction entirely. I got it back, slowly, in watercolor classes and hiking boots and late conversations with my sister. It was Courtney who reached out first, which surprised me. She called on a Sunday in October, Daniel's usual call time, which made me wonder if he had asked her to and then lost his nerve. She asked if I might be willing to have dinner with the two of them when they came to Portland for Christmas. I said yes, because I was not interested in permanent estrangement. I was interested in honesty. We met at a restaurant on the waterfront. Daniel was quieter than usual. Courtney, to her credit, was direct. "We want to talk about what happened," she said. "Or Daniel wants to, don't you?" He looked at his water glass for a moment. Then he looked at me. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for what I said at the reception." I waited. "For a long time," he said slowly, "I told myself that what you gave me, all of it, was just what parents do. And because I told myself that, I stopped seeing it. Or I stopped letting myself see it. Because if I really saw it, I'd have to feel something about how much you sacrificed. And that was..." He stopped. That was uncomfortable. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. Maybe the most honest thing he had ever said to me, because honesty is easier when you are a child and get harder to access as you become someone with things to protect. "I heard you," I said. "At the reception. What you said about me being there." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know," he said. "I figured. When you left, I want you to know that I didn't leave because I was devastated," I said, and this was true. Or at least partly true. "I left because I finally understood something. I had been organizing my entire life around being useful to you, and that's not love. That's something else, something that wasn't healthy for either of us." Courtney was very still across the table. I got the sense she had heard some version of this from Daniel before, perhaps in their living room, on a night when things came apart enough to become honest. "I'm not going to stop being your mother," I told him, "but I'm also not going to stop being Margaret." I should have held on to her a lot sooner. Daniel reached across the table and put his hand over mine. He looked so much like Robert in that moment that it nearly broke me, but I held very steady. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I know," I said. "I believe you. We did not fix everything at that dinner. That is not how real repair works. There were more conversations, some of them difficult. Some of them things I did not know we still needed to say until we were saying them." Daniel came to Portland alone in February, and we spent a weekend, just the two of us, which was the first time we had done that since he left for college. We went to the Japanese garden. We had breakfast at a diner where everything cost $9. We drove out to the coast and walked on the beach in the cold, the way we used to when he was a boy. He asked about Robert, which he almost never did. I told him everything, the things I had kept gentle and manageable over the years, but also the harder truths, the fear, the exhaustion, the way I had made Daniel my reason for continuing because I needed a reason. He listened the way adults listen, with his whole face. And when I finished, he said, "I think I made it too easy to disappear into me. Mom, I think I let you." It was the right thing to say. I told him so. What I did not do, what I want to be clear I did not do, was return to the old arrangement. I did not restart the transfers. I did not begin organizing my calendar around his schedule again. When he and Courtney set a wedding date for the following October, I told them I was thrilled and I meant it. And when they began discussing plans, I listened and offered opinions when asked, and did not offer to pay for things I could not afford. His future mother-in-law, Patricia, called me once, I believe, to feel out whether I would be contributing to the wedding budget. I told her warmly that Daniel and Courtney were handling their own finances beautifully, and that I was so looking forward to being a guest. There was a pause in which I could hear her recalibrating. I enjoyed that pause. The wedding was on a Saturday in October, in a barn venue outside of Ann Arbor. It was exactly the kind of wedding that fits two people who value aesthetics and have opinions about table settings. It was beautiful. I wore a deep burgundy dress that my friend Carol from the watercolor class helped me pick out, and I felt, for the first time in many years, like a woman who took up the right amount of space. I was seated at a table with Daniel's old lab mates, and a couple I didn't know who turned out to be wonderfully funny. I drank exactly the right amount of wine. I danced once with a retired professor who was an excellent dancer. I watched my son marry a woman who, I had come to understand, was better with him than I had initially credited her for, sharper in the ways he needed sharpness, more grounded in the places where he floated. During the toasts, Daniel's best man spoke, then Courtney's sister, and then Daniel stood up. He held his glass and he looked around the room, and when his eyes found me, he paused for just a moment, the way you pause when you see something you want to fix in your memory. He talked about his father, briefly and beautifully. He said, "I grew up watching one person figure out how to be everything at once, and I used to think that was just what she was just capable. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand it was a choice she made every single day, and that it cost her things I can never fully repay." He raised his glass. "To my mother, Margaret, who taught me that love is not the same thing as disappearing for someone. I just wish I'd understood it sooner." 200 people raised their glasses. I did not cry, which surprised me. I had thought I would. Instead, I felt something quieter than tears, a settling, like a house adjusting to its foundation after a long season of weather. I raised my glass, and I smiled at my son across the room, and I thought, this is enough. This right here is exactly enough. There is something I want to say to anyone listening to this who recognizes any piece of what I have described. I am not telling you to stop giving to the people you love. That is not the lesson. The lesson is smaller and more specific than that. The lesson is that when giving becomes disappearing, when you have erased so much of yourself that you exist only in relation to someone else's needs, that is not sacrifice. That is a slow kind of loss that you will eventually need to grieve. I am 63 years old. I live in a studio apartment in Portland that I have made, genuinely, into a home. I have a watercolor of the Oregon coast on my wall that I painted myself, badly and happily. I have a book club and a hiking group and a sister I call on Sundays. I have a son who is learning slowly, genuinely how to love me in ways that don't require me to make myself smaller. I sold my house on a Tuesday. It was raining. I would make different choices now, not because I regret loving my son, but because I understand that the greatest thing a mother can model for her child is not sacrifice without limit. It is a life, a real, full, continuous life, that belongs entirely to her. I lost that for a while. I found it again, and that is, I think, the most important thing I have ever done.